Back in 2018, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and I thought some time in nature would do me good. I picked a remote spot in a national park that I had never been to before. It was a bit out of the way, but I was looking for solitude. I arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon, set up my tent, and took in the surroundings. It was beautiful. Thick woods all around, the sound of birds, and a small creek nearby. There was no one else around, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the rest of the day hiking and taking pictures. By the time I got back to my tent, it was starting to get dark, so I made a small fire and cooked some dinner. The first night was pretty uneventful. I slept well, though I did wake up a few times because of the usual forest sounds. Rustling leaves, twigs snapping, the distant call of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary. The second day, I decided to explore further. I found a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods and followed it for a few hours. It was peaceful, but as the day went on, I started to get this uneasy feeling. You know that sensation when you feel like you're being followed? I shrugged it off as just being paranoid from being alone. I turned back and headed to camp, arriving just before dusk. That night, things got weird. As I was lying in my tent, I started hearing noises. Not the usual forest noises, but something else, like footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. They would start and stop, moving closer to my tent, then backing away. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but saw nothing. The footsteps would stop whenever I looked, only to start again once I was back in my tent. I barely slept that night. Every little sound had me on edge. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but relieved to see the sun. I spent the day close to camp, too tired and wary to venture far. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. That evening, as I was preparing for another sleepless night, I noticed something strange. The ground around my tent had footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. They weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots, and these were barefoot prints. My heart started racing. I was miles away from the nearest road or settlement. Who would be out here, barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I decided to pack up and leave the next morning. As much as I wanted to stay and prove to myself that I could handle it, I wasn't taking any chances. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I kept the fire going and sat up, clutching a hunting knife I had brought along just in case. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time they were closer and more frequent. I could hear them moving around my camp, stopping just at the edge of the firelight. My flashlight revealed nothing every time I pointed it towards the sounds. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was out there. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a low whispering. It was too faint to make out the words, but it was definitely human. I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. I shouted into the darkness, trying to scare whoever it was away, but there was no response, just more whispering and the occasional footstep. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light of day appeared, the noises stopped. I quickly packed up my gear, not even bothering to eat breakfast, and started the hike back to my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed, but I didn't dare to stop and check. When I finally reached my car, I was exhausted, terrified, and relieved all at once. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my apartment. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they didn't find anything unusual. No signs of anyone else in the area, no other reports of strange activity. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there. Maybe it was some weirdo living off the grid, maybe just a prankster. But it felt a lot more sinister than that. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. The woods may be beautiful, but they can also be very, very scary. In the summer of 2019, my buddy Mark and I decided to go on a camping trip. We had a few days off work and wanted to get away from the city. We picked a spot in a national forest we hadn't been to before. It was known for its beautiful scenery and remote campsites. Perfect for some peace and quiet. We arrived at the campsite around noon, set up our tent, and got everything ready. It was a gorgeous spot, right by a lake with mountains in the background. We spent the day fishing, swimming, and just lounging around. By evening, we had a nice fire going and were cooking up the fish we caught. The first night was fine. We stayed up late, talking and laughing, and eventually went to sleep. I woke up a few times because of the usual forest noises, but nothing unusual. The next day, we decided to hike a trail that looped around the lake and into the woods. About halfway through the hike, we came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Being the curious types, we decided to check it out. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside was pretty trashed. Broken furniture, graffiti, and some weird symbols we did not know. But something felt off about the place, like we shouldn't be there. We didn't stay long and continued our hike. When we got back to camp, it was getting dark. We started another fire, cooked dinner, and tried to shake off the weird feeling from the cabin. That night, as we were sitting by the fire, we started hearing noises in the woods. At first it was just rustling, but then it turned into snapping branches and what sounded like footsteps. We tried to convince ourselves it was just animals, but it was hard to ignore how human it sounded. We called out a few times, but there was no response. The footsteps would stop when we spoke, and then start up again a few minutes later. It was unnerving, to say the least. We decided to turn in, hoping it would just go away. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud noise, like something heavy falling or being thrown. I grabbed my flashlight and nudged Mark awake. We stepped out of the tent to find our campsite in disarray. Our cooler was tipped over and some of our stuff was scattered around. What really freaked us out was the large rock lying in the middle of our camp. It hadn't been there before. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, not really sleeping, just listening. The footsteps returned, circling our camp, stopping and starting. It was like someone was toying with us. We couldn't see anything, but we knew something or someone was out there. By morning, we were both exhausted and more than a little freaked out. We decided to pack up and leave, but when we went to get our gear, we found more rocks around the campsite. Some were small, some were pretty big, and they were arranged in weird symbols, the same symbols we saw when we were at the cabin. Neither of us knew what they meant, but it felt like a warning. We quickly packed up and started the hike back to our car. The whole way we felt like we were being watched. Every now and then we'd hear footsteps behind us, but whenever we turned around, there was nothing. It was the longest hike of my life. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear in and got out of there as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were miles away. This happened to me and my friend Jake back in the summer of 2016. We had no idea our little adventure would turn into such a nightmare. Jake and I were always up for an adventure, so we decided to go camping in a remote part of a national park we had heard about. It was known for its beautiful trails and pristine lakes, but also for being pretty isolated. We thought it would be perfect to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. We arrived at the park in the early afternoon, hiked a few miles into the woods, and found a nice spot by a small, serene lake. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the day fishing and exploring. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and not another soul in sight. As evening fell, we started a fire and cooked our dinner. We were enjoying the sounds of nature and the crackling of the fire when we noticed something strange. Across the lake there was a faint, flickering light. It looked like another campfire, but we were sure we hadn't seen anyone else around. We tried to ignore it, thinking maybe someone else had arrived after us and set up camp. But the light didn't stay still. It seemed to move slowly along the edge of the lake. It was odd, but we didn't think much of it at the time. After a while, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire, secured our food, and crawled into the tent. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but a few hours later I woke up feeling uneasy. I had this strange sense that something was off. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The light was gone, but the forest was eerily quiet. No sounds of insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. I shook Jake awake, and he groggily asked what was going on. Before I could answer, we both heard it. A low, rhythmic drumming sound coming from the direction of the lake. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously stepped out of the tent. The drumming was getting louder, and it seemed to be coming closer. We scanned the area with our lights but couldn't see anything. Suddenly, the drumming stopped. We stood there, straining to hear anything else, but there was only silence. Just as we were about to go back to the tent, we heard a splash in the lake. We turned our lights toward the water and saw ripples, as if something had just entered or exited the lake. Our nerves were on edge, and we decided to stay up the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch. Jake took the first shift while I tried to get some sleep, though I doubt I got more than a few minutes of rest. The sense of unease was overwhelming. Around dawn, Jake shook me awake, looking pale and frightened. He pointed towards the lake, and I saw what had him so scared. On the shore, where the light had been the night before, there were strange symbols drawn in the sand. They looked like some kind of ancient runes or markings, and neither of us had any idea what they meant. We quickly packed up our gear, not wanting to stick around to find out who or what had made those symbols. As we were packing, we noticed something even more disturbing. Our backpacks had been moved and were now sitting closer to the water's edge, as if someone had gone through them while we slept. We didn't waste any more time. We hiked back to the car as fast as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. The whole way, we felt like we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful and inviting the day before, now felt sinister and threatening. When we finally reached the car, we threw our stuff in the trunk and sped out of there. We didn't stop until we were miles away from the park. We never reported the incident, partly because we didn't think anyone would believe us, and partly because we just wanted to forget about it. To this day, I have no idea what we encountered out there. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence, or maybe there was something more to it. Either way, it was enough to put me off camping in remote areas for a long time. The wilderness can be beautiful, but it can also hide things that are better left undiscovered. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.